Thank you, Jody, and thank you also, Shanti. That was a wonderful presentation. There you are. Okay, back there. Wonderful presentation, and actually I'm going to skip through some of the slides that I have because you've covered the territory. So it's great to know that great minds work in the same circles. So I'm Reverend Talitha Arnold. I am the pastor for the United Church of Santa Fe, which is part of the denomination known as the United Church of Christ, basically mainline to progressive Protestant. But I also serve on the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which was started in 2010 as a private and public partnership with Department of Defense, Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and Veterans Affairs, along with the private sector, including organizations like the American Association of Psychiatrists or Psychologists, social work organizations, and also from the corporate, construction, all different kinds of industries, because as we all know, suicide prevention is something that mental health issues and suicide prevention cut across all different kinds of boundaries of one kind or another. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you a little bit about this new resource that just came out about 6 months ago. It's called HOPE, and it's about suicide prevention, the roles that faith communities can have in fostering good mental health and also suicide prevention for children and youth. It's a guidebook. It has actually been put together by the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, as well as the Partnership Center, which is also part of the federal government. So I think you have some. I think there are some extra copies around here. It covers a lot of the ground that I'll be covering, as well as some other practical resources as well. With that as an introduction, let's go ahead and get into the slides. Jody, thank you. I am going to sort of skip through some of them. Okay. So next one. A question. What I oftentimes ask anybody who is a part of any kind of faith community, what brought you here today? And each of you will answer that question in a different way. What brings me here today is both I'm a pastor and also, I've worked with people and families, individuals over several decades now. But also what brings me here today is my own family history of a family history that did involve both what was labeled as suicide and also other kind of mental health issues in my family. And as a teenager, both as a child and also as a teenager, I never heard the word suicide, mental health, schizophrenia, PTSD wasn't even labeled at that point, in the church that I was growing up in, even though it was a very liberal church. And for me, it felt like when the church couldn't talk about, my faith community couldn't talk about such issues, then it felt like God couldn't either. And so it increased the sense of isolation and all those kinds of things because of the stigma around mental health issues and also suicide. I never intended to go into ministry, that's a whole other story, and I also never intended to have suicide prevention or mental health issues be such a part of my ministry. But God works in mysterious ways and in all kinds of ways. And it wasn't really until I was a young minister serving a church. I'm from Arizona originally, but I did my divinity school work back east and served a church back east for a number of years before moving to Santa Fe in '87 to take the job that I currently have. I'd never had heard any of those words that I just mentioned: suicide, schizophrenia, mental health, etc., mental illness, preach or in any kind of church setting until 1985, when I heard a sermon, and it happened to be the sermon I was preaching for the church that I was serving. And after that particular sermon, people came out of the woodwork in that congregation, sharing with me and with the senior minister their own experiences. Because the church had been so silent in so many, not just that local church, but faith communities in general had been so silent about these concerns. So that's what brings me here today. What else brought me here today, and perhaps what else brought you here today, next slide, or next, there we go, is the promise of faith. And within my own tradition, as a Christian, that includes the story of Hagar, for example, that Hagar was a young woman enslaved by Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is jealous of her, and so Abraham sends her out into the wilderness to die. But in that, and she's ready to die. She says, Lord, I'm done. But then God opened up her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and her life was saved. So I want to remind us all that faith communities, whatever the tradition is, can be wells of water, can be wells of life-giving water in the wilderness of mental health issues, suicide, etc. And there are a number of stories in the biblical tradition, and that's the tradition I come from, both Hebrew Bible and also Christian Scripture, of people being at the end of their rope, contemplating suicide because of the tragedies of their lives, and yet they don't. There's actually only two instances, one for sure, Saul, who fell on his sword King Saul, because he was going to be captured by the enemy, from the Hebrew Bible tradition. And there is some stories that Judas died by suicide. That's not necessarily the case, because there's only one gospel that talks about that. So you have all of these people in the biblical tradition, as well as in other traditions, who have all manner of difficulties and challenges in life, but they don't take their own lives, because somehow they find the well of water. And I don't mean that they talk about a certain creed or doctrine or whatever, but that they have a community, they have connection, they have hope. And so I put forward to you today that faith communities, spiritual communities, can be those wells of water in the wilderness. And part of my role as a pastor, and also in the work that I do with faith communities, is to expand and deepen those wells. Next slide. So why include faith communities in suicide and prevention? Intervention and prevention. Suicide affects people across faith traditions. It also, suicide attempts and ideations are crises of faith. It's not just I'm isolated from other people, I'm isolated from the very source of life itself. I feel like there's no hope. Faith communities can address those issues. The assets and the strengths that we offer, faith leaders and faith communities are on the front line. I'll talk about that in just a minute. We care for whole persons and for families, and we care for them over a stretch of time. I'm sort of an anomaly. I've served the church that I serve now for almost 40 years. So I've seen kids from the time they were born up to their middle age, and worked with families as well. And even if a pastor is only with a congregation for 3 or 4 years, or a rabbi is only with a congregation for 3 or 4 years, that you still see them over a stretch of time. Unlike teachers, for whom I have great respect, my mom was a teacher, people don't graduate and the relationship doesn't end at the end of nine months. It extends over a period of time. And we interact with diverse people in diverse settings. People who form communities of faith, whether they're Jewish or Hindu or Christian or whatever, come from all different kinds of backgrounds, and they have all different kinds of jobs, all different kinds of family configurations. And also, we have a voice and therefore a responsibility for advocacy for policy issues that affect mental health. Some of the things that were just being brought up now, the lack of mental health clinics, the lack of nets for bridges, which I think is an issue here in Taos. Other things that can contribute to suicide prevention. Faith communities have a role of being advocate for such policies. But to be honest, and this is an important part of it, go ahead. I had all these sort of, yeah. Some faith traditions, some faith communities, some faith leaders have been a part of the problem when it comes to fostering good mental health and suicide prevention. Sometimes mental illness has been seen as a sin, as a moral failing, as God's judgment, or a test of faith. Go ahead. And also the silence and secrecy around mental health and suicide. Next one. And also sometimes communities have focused solely on individual issues or the family without engaging the systemic issues that impact mental health and suicide, such as racism, such as gender discrimination, such as poverty, gun violence, etc. But the good news is that many faith traditions in the last several decades, as we've understood science, research, medicine has understood more the brain chemistry issues around mental illness, that wonderful slide, Shanti, that you showed. I never saw a slide like that until I was in my 20s, because there wasn't that same kind of understanding of brain chemistry and brain makeup. And as a result of that, faith communities do have an opportunity to learn, and some faith traditions have. And so really across the board, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, whatever, maybe not the whole faith tradition, but certainly significant numbers of people in a multitude of faith traditions understand mental illness now as just that. It's an illness. It's not a sin. It's an illness. It's not a moral failing. It's an illness. It's not because you don't love somebody enough. Loving people is really important, but it can't cure schizophrenia, okay? Because our brains are wired in a certain kind of way. And so those kinds of changes have come into place. And also that the silence is being broken, and also clergy do see their role more as we're not mental health professionals, but we can partner with mental health professionals. It's a team effort, just like partnering with school educators and other people. You already know a lot of these statistics. Ages 10 to 18 in this country, suicide's the third leading cause of death. Under 30, third leading cause of death after accidental death, drug overdoses, et cetera, et cetera. And twice as many people die by suicide than homicide in this whole country. Next slide. Okay. Risk factors, the public health concern. These are some risk factors. Shanti's already talked about them. Loss of loved ones, unemployment, economic, social, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. And that all was increased during the pandemic. There's also, as Shanti pointed out, and as I think you have already begun to talk about, there's the impact of communal grief. There's the impact of some communities are more affected by mental health issues and suicide than others for all kinds of reasons. I mean, remember during the pandemic, Native communities lost whole generations of their elders. And that was already for communities dealing with poverty, racism, and history of generational trauma. So that Native American communities and sometimes poor Hispanic or Black communities have much more impact of suicide and mental health issues than white middle-class people. Economics, poverty, race plays a part in all of that. Immigrant communities here in this country, both during the pandemic, were greatly impacted because of all the deaths that were happening not only within their own communities but also back home. Violence back home, whether the home is Sudan or Ukraine or any place else. But also the issues around immigration and refugees, et cetera, in our own country. That is not healthy mentally for those persons most affected by that. Issues of gender violence or racial violence, driving while Black or walking while Asian, are the kinds of discrimination and violence that LGBTQ kids not just kids, but adults can also experience. Churches, synagogues, temples all have a role in addressing these kinds of issues. So these are some basics for suicide prevention for faith leaders, and some of them correspond again with Shanti's presentation. Number one, either whether you're a clergy or a layperson, be prepared. Know what the resources are and help prepare your congregation. Include mental health and suicide concerns in any communication about health. Second one is take talk of suicide seriously, as Shanti pointed out. And know that previous suicide attempts can oftentimes increase the risk. It's one of the risk factors. This is this is something I've only learned in the last 10 or 15 years. But it's of help for me to at least understand it. Suicidal persons often feel ambivalent about dying, what they really want is for the current pain to end. There's a difference. There's a difference. I may not want to die, but I don't want to feel like I felt when my boyfriend broke up with me. You see the difference between those two? And so if the church, the synagogue, the temple, the school, the teacher can somehow intervene and help the kid get to the next day, or the next 2 days, or the next 3 days, that is a very important suicide prevention factor. As a friend of mine said, you know, when you're 15, you don't know that the sun's going to come up the next day. You don't know that you can live through getting a D plus or failing a class or not getting into the college or not getting onto the team or all those things that go through our lives. We don't have the experience of knowing that people can live through those times and the sun will come up tomorrow. So I think to frame the conversation around suicide prevention, around relieving pain, which also then helps save lives. And then also that suicidal persons are experiencing tunnel vision on steroids, if you will. That we can't see that there are other options. We can't see that there's another way of being. And that's, I think, again, particularly true for adolescents. And I think particularly true for adolescents in our time. I mean, these kids, as you all know, are dealing with the pandemic from 4 years ago, and life still hasn't gone back to, quote, whatever normal is supposed to be. And then how do you get out of that stress in order to be able to see whatever other options might be? And finally, asking a person about suicidal feelings. Are you thinking of taking your own life? Don't be afraid to ask that question. There's a myth that if we ask somebody about suicide, that will cause them to do it. It's exactly the opposite. Sometimes we have to be the one who breaks the silence. Yeah, these are all things that Shanti also talked about. But let me just go ahead and a couple things. One is a very important risk factor. For adults, it's I don't want to be a burden to others, or I can't provide for my family, or I'm going to be shamed because I've lost my job, or disappointing others. And adolescents experience that, or at least I remember experiencing that on a regular basis. Disappointing my family, disappointing my teachers, disappointing my best friend, disappointing God, disappointing whomever. So those are all different kinds of risk factors in that. Go ahead. Thank you. Additional warning signs: alcohol or drugs, sleeping a little too much, mood swings, et cetera, et cetera. Go ahead. Okay, Shanti's already gone through all of this, and it was helpful to hear about the problems with 988 here in Taos, because that's one of the things we've talked about on the National Action Alliance. When it was rolled out almost 2 years ago now, there's also, it's not like the magic wand, because it so much depends on what the state or what the region or what the city can offer. And if that's not being done, then calling 988 isn't going to do any good. And that's the public policy issue. One of the things you can do as a community is be in touch with our state legislators and get them to, or at least advocate for increasing funds for behavioral health. One thing that if you choose to, you can also call for help, but also accompany the person to like the ER, but don't do it by yourself. Even if they don't have a weapon or something, you don't want to be driving someone who is in that particular state who might open up the car door while you're driving. So make sure that you've got someone else to support you if you're transporting somebody to a doctor's office or to the ER. And also pay attention to the family. Again, this is where faith communities can be of great help, because we deal with the whole family. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with, adult children of aging parents in the congregation who don't have any kind of grounding in a community, but then their parent is in trouble. And so you try to reach out to the family as well. Next slide. Know your resources and have your game plan ahead of time. Who can you call? What will you do? Who will support the person who's going to support the family, who's going to support you. I always tell faith leaders, don't wait until the person's sitting in your office or you've got the phone call saying, I'm in trouble. Know what you're going to do ahead of time. Next time. Dealing with resistance to mental health treatment, all of these kinds of things. But I think what's most helpful is the faith leader, and by that I don't mean just the clergy person, I mean the faith community as a whole, being willing to say there is hope. And it's not Pollyannish hope. Okay, I'm dating myself. But some of you know who Pollyanna was. Okay, is our own trust that help is possible, that things can change, and that the community will walk with the person or with the family through that valley of shadows. And also to faith leaders, faith communities need to know about the theological positions of their own tradition. As I said, many faith traditions have changed their understandings of mental health issues and suicide. When I was a young minister serving as an associate back in Connecticut, there was a boy, senior in high school, who was Catholic, and he died by suicide. And this was 40 some odd years ago. His parents were not allowed to bury him in the sacred ground of the Catholic cemetery. That has completely changed in almost 90% of all Catholic understandings. The same thing is true within Protestantism and within other traditions as well. And that even in a tradition like Islam or some branches of Christianity where actions are judged on the basis of competency, there's still the understanding that mental health is just that. It's a health issue. It's an illness issue. It is not a sin issue. And you need to be ambassadors around that, because it's out there in the culture that it's still a sin. Whether people are involved in a church community or a synagogue or whatever, there's still that in understanding. You all need to be advocates for saying that's not true any longer. Okay? And that faith leaders need to create a culture of understanding. It's okay. Let your congregation, let your friends know it's okay to talk about it. It can be simple as having like this workbook available, putting up a poster of your coalition about breaking the silence. That signals to a congregation, this is an okay place to talk about these things. Keep going. Oops. Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yes. Yeah. Okay. I think that these are all strengths to build on. You don't have to, if you're part of a faith community, you don't have to import a new program. You need to figure out what it is you're already doing that is a suicide prevention factor. Everything from offering connection, offering classes, being ready to, and offering messages of hope. Go ahead. These are all protective factors that faith communities can offer, what I just offered. Go ahead. Let me just outline a couple things. Groups. Groups for youth, groups for parents, groups for older people, groups that are intergenerational, so that young people can learn from older people. You can live through your boyfriend or your girlfriend breaking up with you. I was a young minister doing as an intern year out in Arizona at my home church. And I was 25, and I had all the angst that a 25-year-old had. My boyfriend didn't love me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in seminary, and yada, 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 yada. The people who saved my life were the really old people in that congregation, the 70-year-olds, the 80-year-olds. You're supposed to laugh at that, since I'm now calling them old. The 70-year-olds, the 80-year-olds, the 90-year-olds, they'd lived through the Great Depression, they'd lived through World War II, they'd lived through the death of children, the death of spouse, the death of their own dreams, and they still got up every morning and they still could find beauty and joy in this world. To a 25-year-old, that was a life-giving message. That church saved my life. Just in terms of not going into despair because my 25-year-old life wasn't turning out like I wanted it to. Churches, communities, faith can do that. And also we have faith communities have frontline leaders. And I don't mean, again, just the clergy. The youth minister, the nurture center coordinator, the teachers, the Sunday school teachers, the Sabbath teachers, etc. They're all on the front lines and they need to be trained. You're the office administrator, the choir director. You have a whole community of people that need to know what mental health and suicide prevention is about. Go ahead. Educational opportunities, all different kinds of things. Go ahead. And also that communities of faith can offer narratives of hope. We offer the narratives of hope from our spiritual traditions, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or whatever, but we also offer narratives of hope historically. For my generation, the civil rights movement. That was a huge change in the life of this country. We've regressed a lot, but it was a huge change. But also the narratives of hope of things like Black Lives Matter, that people can take charge of their lives and try to change this world. And the narratives of hope from the individuals in the congregation. Go ahead. Narratives of hope in the Bible. There are more young people in the Bible than there are old people. Hagar, Ruth, Jesus, the disciples. They were a lot younger. They were much more Shanti's age than my age. I'm up there with Abraham and Sarah. Okay, next one. Okay, almost done. The other thing too, for any of you from a Christian tradition, it is so very important to know the way that in Christian scripture, in Christian Gospels, the 4 Gospels, there are more instances of Jesus healing someone with some kind of mental illness that in the first century of Christianity was defined as, having a troubled spirit, having a demonic spirit or whatever, first century ways of talking about mental health. There are more instances of Jesus healing people of those kinds of afflictions than all the other healing stories put together. Blind, lame, leprosy, etc. You put them all together and there are still fewer instances of those kinds of healings than Jesus reaching out, offering love, compassion, and healing to persons with some kind of mental health or neurological issue. Which says to me, as a Christian pastor, then that needs to be central in our ministries as well. And that Jesus did it not with not the exorcist head spinning around or levitating or whatever, but with compassion, with hope, with care, both for the individual and also for the family. We can talk more about that later, but I want to really underscore that because then I think, for me at least, that's some of the passion that comes with working with faith communities on mental health issues. Next one. One more. Yeah, go ahead and, there we go. Okay, one of the stories that I think is most important in Christian scripture about Jesus healing somebody with a mental health issue was the story of someone who was, as he said, possessed by legions of demons. He was living in the tombs, in the cemetery, in the graveyard outside of the city of Gadara, which is up in what is modern-day Jordan, northwestern part of Jordan. Outside a huge, huge city, Gadara, which was a big Roman city with all kinds of money and wealth and elites and everything else. And this guy couldn't live in the city. He lived out in the tombs. If that is not an indictment of the social justice issues around mental health 2,000 years ago, I don't know what is. You see what I mean? It's not just my individual issue. It's the social justice, economic justice issues that surround mental illness. We've talked about that we learn from one another about resiliency, hope, and strength. And so one of the things that faith communities can do is pair older adults with younger adults or with teens. Like I said in my story about being 25 and learning from the 75-year-olds. Or pairing parents whose kids have grown and they've managed to survive everybody's adolescence, the parents and the kids, with parents who are in the thick of things. Next slide. Worship is pastoral care. Go ahead, just do it all. Yeah. Sermons and services, not just waiting till Mental Health Month, and not just waiting till Suicide Prevention Sunday, et cetera, but weave that into the messages that you're giving the church community. Prayers. If you're going to pray for people with cancer or with heart disease, then we better be praying for people who also have some kind of mental illness. Now, there's the issues of confidentiality, have to be respected, but I guarantee you, if in the pastoral prayers or in your prayer chain, there's references to holding in prayer those persons and families who are dealing with mental health issues or with suicide issues, that signals to the congregation God can handle it. Music. Research shows the positive impact of getting all that oxygen in your body from singing, and also the just singing together is a mental health enhancer. And you don't have to be the perfect alto or even be a tenor in order to do that. Just singing with others. Rituals, baptism, funerals, those are all times of pastoral care. And my friends, even if somebody has died by suicide, if you have the family's permission, talk about it in the sermon. Because as somebody was saying earlier, I think Jody, you were the one who was saying it, that families oftentimes feel responsible. Families or friends. A funeral for somebody who has died by suicide is an opportunity to address that issue and point blank say, it's not your fault. You've got a congregation that you're talking to, and they may never have set foot inside any kind of faith community, but they need to hear it's not your fault. And then also having young people in leadership roles, whether it's leading worship or whether it's helping out with a social justice concern, so that kids and adults know we are more than our illnesses. More than our illnesses. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry for this to go on as long as it is, but anyway, these are all sort of fleshing out what I just said. Finally, advocacy in action. We did an anti-bullying covenant that we put in the newspaper a number of years ago to signal to kids and to the wider community that those kinds of issues those policy and action issues are important. And similarly with getting kids involved in helping in service projects or also looking at the root causes of mental health, lack of mental health provisions in our state. Advocate, that's a job that every faith community needs to be involved in. It's not just about the individual, it's not just about my little community, it's about the whole community that we live in. We've got to be faith leaders, faith communities have got to be advocates for treatment facilities, both outpatient and clinical, hospital, better funding for research, for clinics, etc., training for those who work with people at risk, reducing the means of suicide, like bridge nets, and educating the media around suicide prevention and messaging. It's not somebody committed suicide, it's somebody died by suicide. Not glamorizing it, paying attention to the toll that it takes. Each one of you in this room can write a letter to the editor. Each one of you in this room can write to your local county officials, city officials, state officials, federal officials. And also, it's up to faith communities to make the connection between mental health issues and the issues of poverty, racism, sexual discrimination, religious discrimination. Go ahead and yeah. And standing, I believe that standing in solidarity with communities dealing with the virus of hate is a mental health action. As a white, straight, reasonably employed woman, I have a moral responsibility, and so does the congregation I serve, to stand up for persons of other communities who experience racism, gender discrimination, hatred in any form or shape. That's what my faith calls me to be about, it's what my soul calls me to be about, and it's what a community of faith must be about. Okay, one last, I think there's last one. Go ahead and do, yeah, yep, go ahead. Bottom line, caring for persons with mental illness and for their families and loved ones is a team effort. Use the team that you have, whether it's your school, your faith community, your circle of friends, or this wonderful gathering. And do exactly what you're doing today, which is to provide the education. Okay? I think it's one last slide. That's right. Just basically, faith communities have a role in mental health and preventing teen suicide. That's it. Thank you.